PowerPoint that is for this week's work called Modern Genetics. You had the PDF file that you could just look at on your own and read it to yourself, but I kind of thought this would be more like real teaching if you get to hear somebody explain the slides. So as we go through this, I'll just be reading what's on the screen, but also making some comments that might be helpful for you to understand it. And if you have any other questions, you can always message me through Schoology, or you can send me an email at wmcnally@pmschools.org. All right, so here we go, modern genetics. First, we're going to review some important vocabulary that goes with this unit. A lot of this you learned about in your last unit, which was genetics, learning about how things are inherited. So traits, those are the characteristics you have. Examples here are brown hair, brown eyes, being tall. Other ones could be having 2 kidneys, the shape of your eyes, your hair color, having freckles. All of those things are traits that make us all unique and different, and also make you different from other organisms, like monkeys or chipmunks. Alleles is what determines your traits. Now, because you have 2 parents, you inherited 2 alleles. They're the alternate forms of a gene. So the 2 alleles could be one for brown eyes and another one from blue eyes. Maybe your mom gave you the trait or the allele for brown eyes, but your dad gave you the allele for blue eyes, and you're going to have some combination of that, which we did Punnett squares for, and you guys figured all that out. Okay, so remember, you could have 2 capitals or 2 lowercase or one of each. Heredity is what we call the passing of genetic information from one generation to the next. Sorry about that, guys. From one generation to the next. So what you got from your parents was heredity. And what you're going to give to your children eventually is also heredity. It's the information that's in your cells, in your DNA, that gets passed on to the next generation. All right, so DNA is known as deoxyribonucleic acid. So when we say the 3 letters DNA, it actually refers to this long word where the D comes from the deoxyribo, the N comes from nucleic, and the A comes from acid. So DNA is deoxyribonucleic acid. No one's ever going to ask you to spell this word, but you definitely have to know what it means. So we call DNA the blueprint of life. It's the hereditary material that's found in all organisms. So inside of your cells, you have a nucleus. Inside of your nucleus is your DNA, which we'll talk about in a second, being stored on chromosomes. When they say it's a blueprint of life, another way to think about it is a recipe for life. It's the ingredients and the procedures that make you unique and make you different from every other living thing on the planet. So, as I mentioned in this diagram, the DNA is found in the nucleuses of all of the cells of your body. A gene, and we've talked about that word a lot in the last unit, a gene is just one part of the DNA. It's a specific spot on the chromosome that contains information for a particular trait. So this chromosome here might be carrying this gene, and that gene might be something to do with how tall you're going to be. Or it might be something to do with how your liver functions. So the genes are on your chromosomes. They're just a particular part of the DNA. And that's the last bullet here, is just telling you that these strands here are called chromosomes, and because you're a human, you're going to have 46 of those chromosomes inside the nucleus of all your cells. So chromosomes. Humans have 46 chromosomes. That means that you got 23 chromosomes from your mom and 23 chromosomes from your dad when you were created, the moment of what we call fertilization. So in humans, an egg cell in a female will contain 23 chromosomes, and a sperm cell in a male will contain 23 chromosomes. They each have half of what is needed to make a new offspring. So when the sperm and the egg meet, those two get added together to make that number 46. Now that's just the number for humans. If you're a dog, that number might be 28. If you're a fly, it might be 16. So the number changes depending upon what kind of living thing we're talking about. So out of those 23 chromosomes, 22, most of them, are called autosomes. And that means that they just describe and give traits to all the different parts of your body, with the exception of what the sex chromosomes do. The last pair, number 23, is our sex chromosomes. And that's what's going to determine whether or not someone is male or female. If someone is a male, they have an X chromosome and they have a Y chromosome. Only males can have Y. Females always have two X's. So that means if you're a male, you got an X chromosome from your mom because that's all females have, but your dad contributed a Y chromosome because men produce both X and Y chromosomes. Their sperm could be either or. Females, all of their eggs have X chromosomes on them. So it's always the father that determines whether the baby is going to be a boy or a girl. This slide is on DNA structure. And DNA structure is, as you might have heard, a double helix. And we saw that in the previous slide. These two gentlemen are James Watson and Francis Crick, and they worked together in the 1950s to discover how DNA was shaped. They came up with a model for what we now know, that double helix or that twisted ladder. They could not have done it without the help of this woman, whose name is Rosalind Franklin. She took X-ray images of the DNA to prove that their model was correct. So even though they get all the credit, they could not have done their work without the contributions of the scientist Rosalind Franklin. Like I said, they came up with that design of the double helix structure. So they discovered that DNA is actually two strands twisted together into a twisted ladder or staircase. And when you see the twisted ladder or that double helix, the two sides are held together by weak hydrogen bonds. We're going to get into that more on the next slide. Here's a picture. So this is what DNA looks like when it's twisted. And if we could somehow untwist it to make it look easier to see, it would be like this. A ladder that's got two rails and then steps along the middle. Inside the steps are these bases, which we'll talk about more on the next slide. The bases are held together by weak bonds, not strong bonds, but weak bonds, which will be very important for when we learn about things like DNA replication. So each one of those steps on the ladder is a subunit called a nucleotide. So DNA is made of thousands of subunits called nucleotides. Here's one enlarged here. Okay, there are three parts. The first two parts, the phosphate and the deoxyribose sugar, okay, they are the backbone. They make up the rails of the ladder. And then the third part is a nitrogenous base. The nitrogenous base makes up half of the step of the ladder. So the phosphate and sugar and the nitrogenous base. The deoxyribose is what puts the D in DNA. Together with the phosphate, it makes up the strong rails that support the whole DNA molecule. And the bases are those steps in the middle that are held together by a weak bond. Now you'll have another one on the side of this one. So there's actually two connecting at the base, which is what we saw on the previous slide. Okay, one nucleotide connecting to another nucleotide. And that gets repeated to make a whole strand. And the nitrogenous bases have to match. They are complementary, and they have one pair that they can always work with, which we'll see more in the next slide. So here's the bases. Apples in a tree and a car in the garage. Adenine is the A, and thymine is the T. You find apples on a tree, so you'll always find adenine, you'll always find adenine with thymine. A always pairs with T. Then you have cytosine and guanine. C always pairs with G, just like a car can be found in the garage. You wouldn't find a car in a tree, and you wouldn't find an apple in a garage. Okay, you would find a car in a garage, C's and T's, apples and trees, A's and T's. That's a good way to remember how they go together. If there's ever a mix-up, and you wind up with an A with a G or a C with a T, then that would be something we're going to learn about later called a mutation, which is not usually a good thing. Here's another picture of the DNA, the sugar and phosphate backbone making up the rails of the ladder, and the nitrogenous bases, the C's and the G's and the T's and the A's, put together in the complementary bases. It's important to know that everyone's DNA is different. Like we said, it's the blueprint that makes you, you, and you're unique. So even though we have similar information, it's not exactly the same. So if we all have the same DNA, because we all have A's and C's and T's and G's, or I should say A's and T's and C's and G's, if we always have the same letters paired up, how can we be different? Well, the answer is the sequence, the order of which the letters appear. So Lizette could have A and G and C and T, but Billy might have A and T and C and C. So even though they have the same letters, they're not put together in the same order, and that's why we're not all identical. Some of us are going to have genes for different colored hair, different skin tones, different heights, different favorite foods. A lot of things that make us unique are based upon our DNA. It's because the code, even though it's the same letters, is not made up to be in the exact same order. Okay, so the nitrogen, so we all have DNA made of nucleotides. How are we different? The sequence of the nitrogenous bases makes us unique. That means one of a kind. Your sequence is different from your parents and your siblings. The only exception is identical twins. Brothers and sisters who are identical twins have the exact same DNA to start with. You may have a lot more similar DNA to your brother than you do to your best friend because you and your brother have the same parents, but even so, they're not going to be exactly the same. So that's pretty much the beginning, the first 10 slides of this unit. Tomorrow or next time we're going to go on to the next part of the PowerPoint. But if you have any questions, like I said, make sure you email or message me. Hopefully that was helpful, guys. Take care.